Men lie, women lie, numbers don't. History always repeats itself. So with those two quotes in mind, I looked and analysed the last 100 Western Pokemon regionals or higher level events, not only to understand the numbers and what conclusions we can draw from them, but to also analyse the history of them too. With 9 questions in hand, I painstakingly analysed those past 100 events, and trust me, I was shocked by the main conclusions and takeaways I now have, so make sure to watch this video to the end so you don't miss any of this juicy data. The first question I had for all these events was it a straightforward deck that won the event, or was it a more teched out list? How are we defining tech? Cards that don't necessarily help with the deck's overall strategy and are mainly played to shore up bad matchups. For example, how some Lost Box decks play a Drapion V. This would otherwise be a terrible card to play in Lost Box, since it's a 2-prize Pokemon that attacks for 4 energy, but when you consider that it OHKOs a Mew VMAX for 0 energy, and can even OHKO a Gardevoir EX, it becomes worth the inclusion. And of the 100 winning decks, only 40% of them were techie lists, meaning 60 of them were straightforward consistent lists. And to be honest, I was not really surprised by this. Most of the time a straightforward deck that has most, if not all of its cards pointing towards the overall strategy, this tends to be the way to go. Since if you try and tech for all of your bad matchups at the same time, you can end up, well, just not setting up and losing way more games than you will ever win. The exception to this rule is when the attack is extremely strong at beating a bad matchup and doesn't take up a lot of deck space, so the chances of it affecting your overall deck performance is low. For example, Drapion V for Mew and Giratina for Greninja Bake back in the day. These stand out as good examples since they are effective and are also a 1-card answer. But the problem with these kind of techs is that, well, they don't come around too often because they're extremely good. So as a rule of thumb, let's leave the techs at home, shall we? The most popular deck at an event only wins the event 32% of the time. Now this one I was stunned by. You might think that the most popular deck would be more likely to win the event since it has more people playing it, and normally the most played deck tends to have the highest power level. But I guess when you think about it, everyone else in the event will have a game plan against that deck and will actively be trying to beat it. Not to mention you will get people actively teching for it too. Think of Galarian Moltres in Lost Box now to counter Gardevoir and Mew. However, 55% of the time a winning deck at a regional tends to be in the top 3 most played decks at an event. So I guess the takeaway is, as strange as it sounds to say, is don't play the most popular deck, play the second or third one if you're trying to win. However, if you were playing to just get points, I would probably still recommend playing a Bidoof in most cases. This is backed up by one of the other questions I had, which was the deck that won considered the best deck in format at the time? A little bit subjective, I know, but bear with me. And 29% of the time the Bidoof won, so keep that in mind. 1-prize decks are much less likely to win an event. Only 22% of the time a 1-prize deck won these events, which is strange because I thought being a 1-prize focused deck almost always seemed to be advantageous to me. Maybe because some of these events were during the ADP era, it affected these numbers, but even then Persephone existed as well, so maybe this has something to do with 1-prize decks for the most part tend to take longer to win games, so they are more prone to ties maybe. What was interesting though is that towards the end, Lost Box definitely helped drag that number up. So maybe we were just going through a lull of low powered 1-prize decks and that might be changing moving forward. Who knows? Counter decks and disruption decks are very poor at winning events, with counter decks like Arcturalodon winning events 32% of the time, and 27% of the time it is a disruption deck, Mewtwo v Union for example, that wins an event. This isn't surprising to me though, however, with these decks tending to be the hardest to build in my opinion, and normally yielding themselves to a playstyle that often isn't honed through normal play. These decks are also the most vulnerable to unexpected changes in the metagame, making their success rate rather volatile, leaving aggro decks as almost always the correct choice. But this last one made me very, very sad. Rogue decks only win events a total of 31% of the time. But unfortunately again, this wasn't really a surprise to me, since building and playing a surprise deck at the highest level is extremely hard to do, and the numbers show it. I have videos here on this channel where I try and build cheap decks as surprise decks and see how they do at events, And quite honestly, it takes a long time to get these decks to a decent level, let alone winning a regional or international, hence why it doesn't happen very often. So while it is the dream of many to rock up to an event with a surprise deck and take it all home, the numbers say it is extremely hard to do. So sorry about that. So what are the main takeaways from this analysis then? What things can we use to put ourselves in better positions to win games at events? Well, always playing a top 3 deck for an event seems to give you the best shot at doing well. This shouldn't be too surprising, but I think as players we can get a little bit too carried away with metagaming and thinking way too much about our deck choice. So keep it simple. This is reflected by the counter deck success rate being so low. Alternate win condition decks are not recommended for most players unless you have extreme time to test them out a ton and work out the perfect list for an event. One prize decks, funnily enough, are actually considered slightly overrated in the grand scheme of things, so play them with a pinch of salt. Although I must say decks like Lost Box might be starting to buck this trend. Trying to break the meta with a new road deck statistically has low success rate, so sticking to established archetypes seem to be the way to go. And trust me, that pains me to say, but the numbers just don't lie. Although it must be said that new formats are the best time to take a punt since the meta isn't fully developed yet. And lastly, text should be used sparingly, as it seems to be that straightforward decks have a higher success rate to win an event. Unless those techs are super strong like I mentioned earlier, like Drapion, Spirit Tomb or Giratina for example. However, if you want to completely ignore what I just said, why don't you watch this video here where I take you through the process of building a budget rogue deck and actually take it to an event and see how it does. And if you're in the market for a new deck, why don't you check out this video sponsor Pokédex, where you can get a fully built deck sent to your house as early as the next working day. And check out Dragon Shield, because you are going to need some sleeve to protect those cards no matter what happens.